Hi, you guys. It's Professor Daniel, and I'm back with chapter 10, which is titled Democracy in America. The scope of this chapter is from about 1815 to about 1840. Now, you're probably wondering, weren't we here last chapter? If that's your question, yes, you are correct. We were in this era last chapter. We are in the era of the market revolution. And now we're entering the era, which is around the same time of the age of Jackson. So, last chapter, we really talked about the technological innovations that made the market revolution possible. So, we really focused on innovations in transportation. So, we discussed the steamboat, which made upriver or upstream travel possible. We discussed the railroad, which was significant because one, now you can travel a lot quicker. Now you'll see the expansion of brands because you're able to put products on these railroads and get them to the other side of the country. But we also saw the stimulation of other industries. In order for a locomotive to run, you need coal. So we'll see the stimulation of the coal industry. And in order to build rails and locomotives, you need steel, you need iron. So we'll also see the stimulation of those industries. In this chapter, we're going to focus on what's going on, I would say, at a more societal level. What is going on that is going to shape society? So, for one, this era of American history will see the expansion of democracy. We'll get this idea of universal white male suffrage, or the idea that all white men should be able to vote regardless of property ownership, regardless of tax paying, right? That is universal white male suffrage. This era will also see a huge expansion of slavery as people begin to move more and more west, they'll bring slavery with them. This question of should slavery be allowed in these new territories will be a question that will pop up during this era. Also, during this era, we have a lot of patriotism. There will be questions of what it means to be American and who is deserving of American citizenship. So, we'll get into all of those things, including the age of Jackson. But first, I want to hit on universal white male suffrage and what does that look like historically. So during this time, we see an expansion of voting rights. As a matter of fact, by the end of this era, approximately 90% of white men will be eligible to vote. Now, we a few chapters ago, when we talked about American independence, a lot of these newly formed states will draft constitutions, and some of them will do away with property qualifications for voting, but not all of them. So, this brings us to the Dorr War or Thomas Dorr and the Dorr War, which occurs in Rhode Island. So, this war, it's bloodless, is led by Thomas Dorr with his rallying cry of free suffrage. Thomas Dorr wants to get rid of this property qualification for voting. So in October 1841, the People's Constitution or People's Convention in Rhode Island will redraft the state's constitution in order to do away with property qualifications for voting. However, federal troops will be dispatched. Thomas Dorr will be arrested and he will be found guilty of high treason. So, this is something that is very risky, but you see the importance of the vote. You see the importance of doing away with property qualifications for voting. And that begs really another question. What if we had property qualifications for voting today? That means most of my students, as a lot of you are 18 and 19 and don't have your own places, it means you wouldn't be eligible to vote. Now, this is also a time of you could call it an information revolution. In 1833, we see the rise of the penny press. And the penny press were newspapers that were sold for just 1 cent. Now, this is pretty revolutionary because at this time, newspapers typically went for about 6 cents. So for 1 cent, you could get a newspaper that would emphasize sensationalism and crime stories and exposés and all of the things that you wanted to read about. Benjamin Day went into the newspaper business to save himself from financial ruin, and he ends up publishing The Sun. He sold these newspapers again for a penny at a time where newspapers are being sold for 6 cents because he believed that most working class people were literate. And so he catered the penny press to working class people. So again, the penny press is a newspaper that is catered to working class people that emphasize sensationalism, crime stories, and exposés. Now, around this time, we call it the information revolution because you get the growth of newspapers and the growth of journals. Newspapers are popping up across the country in towns and cities everywhere. And when we get this information, it's very important because it leads to the broad and the very, very rapid transmission of ideas across the nation. And ideas can either divide a nation or they can unite people to a common cause. So, some newspapers and journals that were created at this time were the Freedom's Journal, the Liberator, as well as the Cherokee Phoenix. Now, this again is a time of the information revolution, and Benjamin Day and the Sun and other people who will create their own penny press newspapers will emphasize things that working class people will want to listen to or want to read. This is also important because it brings information to a class of people that perhaps earlier on in American history, information wouldn't have necessarily been focus towards them. If we recall, especially pre revolutionary America and colonial America, there was a tradition of deference, as your book calls it, which means that the idea of office holding and all of these things should be reserved for men of means. So if you have wealth and social prominence, then you are deserving of political office. It's also during this time that we get the American system. So, the American system was a government promoted economic plan of development that was meant to strengthen the nation. So, it was proposed by Henry Clay and it was supported by the Whig Party. So, we'll be focusing mainly as far as presidents in this chapter, we'll be focusing a lot on Andrew Jackson, and he was not a Whig, he was a Democrat. We will get into these different or into this party system a little later on, and it will really start to meld together and make a bit more sense. So, there are three pillars to the American system, okay? So, one, the first pillar of the American system was to create a new national bank because in 1816, the first Bank of the United States was created with a 20-year charter. And so, boom, you have the Bank of the United States created in 1816 with a new charter. And this charter would be for 20 years, meaning that around 1836, there needed to be another charter for the bank or for this financial system and to continue, right? So 18 the first pillar, excuse me, was the creation of a new national bank in 1816, and it was given a 20-year charter. Now, once we talk about Andrew Jackson and the bank war, he will not renew the charter, but I digress. We'll get to that a little later. The second pillar of the American system was to have high protective tariffs on imported goods. And that's something that's really going to help the Northeast section of the United States, because if you recall, that in that area of the United States, that's your manufacturing hub. In the South, they didn't have factories, right? They had human factories called slaves that produced raw materials such as cotton, rice, indigo, tobacco, and so on and so forth. The third and final pillar of the American system was the federal financing of improved roads and canals. And this is something that will help both the South and the West. Now, going back to the first pillar with the Bank of the United States, the Bank of the United States was no longer in existence after 1811. So they had to create another one because the charter had expired. When you don't have a national bank of the United States, that means you don't have a financial agent. That means there was no national currency. And so it was very important to create a second Bank of the United States in order for there to be a main financial agent to operate for the government and for there to be a national currency. Okay. Now, in 1817 to 1825, we have James Monroe, who will serve as president. He will serve as president before the second party system. So he will be what is called at this point a Democratic Republican. What his presidency is most known for, I would say a lot, what is most notable, I would say, during his presidency was the acquisition of Florida as well as the Monroe Doctrine. So in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine is signed by James Monroe, but it is drafted by John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams. So Monroe fears that Spain would try to come back to the Western Hemisphere and regain some of their Latin American countries and colonies. And so the Monroe Doctrine serves as a warning to European powers against further colonization efforts. So I highlighted a few points of the Monroe Doctrine. So, one, the doctrine states that the United States would oppose any further European colonization in Latin America. It also said that the US would not be involved in any more European wars. And the third highlight was that the Monroe Doctrine essentially warns European powers not to interfere with these newly independent Latin American states. James Monroe's presidency, or he is president during this era that's known as the era of good feelings, right? Now, what's really, I would say, ironic about this being known as the era of good feelings is that it's also during this era that we get the American Colonization Society, which will push for emancipation, but emancipation, I'll say, with exportation to Africa. So it's not really pushing for freedom, it is pushing for if you are free, you can be free, but you cannot be free here. It is also quite ironic because in this era, we also have the Missouri Compromise, which is what I will discuss next. So, what was the Missouri Compromise? I'll explain. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 involves the statehood of Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri petitions to enter the United States as a slave state. In order to balance this out, because if you did this, it would make it uneven. You would have more slave states than free states. And so once Missouri petitions to enter the Union as a slave state, Maine will then enter the Union as a free state in order to restore the balance of free states to slave states. So the Missouri Compromise states that no slavery would be permitted above the latitude of 3630, which is Missouri's southern border. So it provides this line essentially that says, in any other states that will petition to be a member state of the Union, if it is above the latitude of 3630, you cannot be a slave state. It adds, or it puts a border, or dare I say, a limit on the expansion of slavery. It keeps slavery as a Southern institution. Okay. So I will come back with the age of Jackson in part two.